Welcome to Georgia Stewart, founder and chief executive of Tumelo, founded in 2018 out of Cambridge University, or prompted by your Cambridge University experience. Can you tell us about the founding zeal, what prompted you, how it came about?
So at Cambridge, me and both my co-founders were involved in something called Positive Investment Cambridge, which was basically an effort to get the university to be a better shareholder. So Cambridge, like many other universities in the UK and in America and other places in the world, has a big endowment, has a big pot of money that's invested into the stock market. But like many endowments and other types of investors, they had very little transparency about where that money was actually going, as in which companies it was actually invested in. And they had even less visibility or kind of voice over how those companies were being run, even though theoretically they are owners of those companies. And so I guess we took issue with that. We were running a campaign along with other people at the university to try and get the university to be a better shareholder, to be a better owner of those companies. And that, I suppose, is what got me into the kind of entangled world of shareholder ownership and stewardship. And it's what made me passionate about this idea that if you could get investors to be more responsible, then you could drive change at these kind of public companies.
And was it an observation that transparency is better? It's a huge sum, £6 billion. There's great responsibility that comes with that. Or did you have some sense of the possible tech solution that would enable that transparency?
So whilst we were doing the campaign, it wasn't tech focused at all. We were kind of running around emailing fund managers and trying to get information from them about where they were investing the assets. And, you know, we wrote white papers and we campaigned out the front of colleges. I think once we left, we started thinking about, well, actually, how could you do this at scale? How could you kind of take this solution, this idea of giving an underlying investor a voice in an issue at a company, and how could you apply that to all of the broker dealers that are in the UK, all of the pension platforms, all of the other endowments who we haven't spoken to, and that's when we started thinking about tech.
And then from there, and I'm sure this is a big leap, at what point did you realize that actually this approach could apply across multiple different areas, particularly pensions, but multiple areas as well?
Well, I think essentially the mechanism is that a publicly traded company, once it lists on the stock exchange, can then be bought by the public and owned by many investors, many types of investors. A publicly traded company like Tesla or Meta, Facebook, can be owned by institutional investors like big fund managers, or individuals like me or your mum. And so I suppose we were looking at the market to try and work out, like, where are most of those people? Who are those people that own these big companies? Who are we trying to get a voice from? Who is interested in affecting change on climate or human rights or gender equality at these companies if they had a voice? And actually pensions is an interesting space because you've got a lot of, very normal people invested with very little visibility. Most people don't even understand that their pension is invested. But you've got a lot of them in one place. So if you go to a big pension provider today, you're talking about trillions in assets in some cases, and many millions of end pension members. And so it's very easy. I mean, I say it's very easy. The idea was it would be easy to reach them if we built a solution that worked with the pension platforms or with the retail investment brokers similarly. So I suppose that's why we started to think about a B2B to C solution, which is effectively software that we sell to investment platforms that they then make available to their underlying pension members or investment customers, whether it's a stocks and shares trading account or a pension platform.
It's a pretty bold aim that you have of bringing shareholder democracy to the global financial system. When you were envisaging that, at what point did you think, actually, this is moving from something which is, specifically relevant to Cambridge Uni to something which could scale? Was there anything approaching a light bulb moment?
No, I suppose we pivoted. It's probably like a better way to think about it. Like we started out thinking that we would own the entire chain. So we were the whole vertical, if you will. So we built an investment platform ourselves, was a financial advisor, we were a robo-advisor. I don't know if you've heard of like Nutmeg or Moneybox, it was that kind of thing. Really focused on sustainable investments, and always with this angle of having full transparency about the companies that we were investing your money in, and allowing you to vote on the upcoming votes at companies like Tesla or Amazon. And then I guess we got quite far down that pipe. We actually became regulated. We had our first users. And we started to think about the idea of actually spinning out the voting as a kind of B2B software solution, where we could take it not just to our own investment platform, but also to other investment platforms. Once we had that idea, we started to see the power of scale, that actually, rather than us having to acquire every investor and then give them a vote, which ultimately was, it's going to take us, I don't know, if you look at the trajectory of the other robo-advisors, it's going to take you years and years and years to get to 1 million investors. We could take our solution to one pension provider and have 1 million investors overnight. And that ultimately, if we really cared about voting and we really cared about shareholder democracy, started to make a hell of a lot more sense. And so that's what we started thinking about. And then we had pension providers approach us and say that they would run a trial and they could have used this software and see if their pension members cared about it. That went really well. And eventually we had to make a hard decision and say, we're going to pursue that and we're not going to do this investment platform, even though we'd spent 150 grand building it and we had a team. And obviously we kept the team and we just focused ourselves on shareholder democracy purely.
And how receptive were the companies in those early days? I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of other entrepreneurs, early stage, tremendous zeal, very zeitgeist, and I know your motivation is much deeper than simply tapping into the zeitgeist. But how do you go from that, this nascent idea, to actually convincing people this is a worthwhile platform for them to invest time as well as money?
Yep. So I guess the stakeholders that we need to convince are broker platforms, so the kind of trading investment platforms I was talking about. They have many different names and different jurisdictions, so I use all three there. And then also fund managers, so they're the ones that currently vote on our behalf. So if you have a pension, whoever's listening to this discussion, then you are probably unaware that someone is voting on gender equality and CEO pay and climate targets on your behalf at the companies your money's invested in, and that person is the fund manager, or that company is the fund manager. So those are the two stakeholders that we need to kind of persuade that this is a good thing for them to do. And I guess ultimately it's the same for every company. You need to work out, like, what's the ROI? Why would a broker spend time integrating this? And the answer is it's good at engaging their customers. They care about acquisition, they care about retention, and we can help with both of those things, because if people feel like they're making impact with their money and they feel like their money is aligned with their values, they're more likely to invest more. And that is a good metric for a broker to care about. On the fund manager side, stewardship is like a regulatory burden. It is a reputational risk. Voting on someone else's behalf on an issue as political as abortion, for example, which is a vote that came up at Walmart last week, that is a difficult thing for a fund manager to judge if they don't have any insight from their underlying customers, and we can provide that insight to them. I suppose we're helped on the ROI front there, the return on investment front, by policy. So there's a lot of, let's not call it policy change, that's probably jumping the gun, but there's a lot of discussion at the policy level, both in the UK and the US, about the kind of worrying amount of power that fund managers have, the lack of connection they have to their underlying investors, and that disconnect actually being quite important and something that needs to be addressed. And we obviously address that problem. So although it's not a regulatory requirement today, it gets a lot of airtime, both with the SEC and the FCA here in the UK, which kind of feeds, or like, I suppose, supports our use case when we're talking to fund managers. So I think, same as any product, really, we're looking for the ROI and trying to work out why our stakeholders would want to get behind the vision that we have.
And when you mention consumers, there's a great video on your site, this moment of discovery, when someone's going through and realizing that's where my pension is invested.
Yeah.
I don't think I fancy that. And of course, we each have our own individual value sets, I guess. And this is, in a sense, democratizing choice, I suppose. It comes down to that. Is that how you see it? Are you in almost a vanguard of a more transparent approach?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think that transparency is the first step. Once you have transparency, being able to give people agency, allow them to have influence. I think there are different ways to affect change. You can lobby, you can drive regulation. I suppose those two are connected. You can use your consumer power. And there is, I believe, a massively untapped power, which is your power as an investor. As an investor, you are an owner in the largest companies in the world. They have the biggest carbon footprints. They have the biggest effect on gender inequality. They have the biggest effect on, supply chain conditions and workers' rights. If you want to change CEO pay, then you need to look at the top 100 companies in the world to do that. I think ultimately, if we are trying to affect change at those companies, we should be employing all of our kind of ability to do that: consumer lobbying / regulatory and investor power. And I think investor power, because of the lack of transparency, is super untapped. Like, people just, well, how do you even go about affecting your investor power? Is, I guess, the question that most people would ask, like, what does that even mean? And for us, that's the narrative that we're trying to tell, and that's the mechanism for affecting change that we are trying to make easier and kind of put in the hands of everyday people, and make it really straightforward for them to be able to do that.
You think about the relevance and continuing, if anything, massively increasingly relevance of your offer. To what extent do you think you had first, or sort of first-ish mover advantage in those early days?
Was
that significant?
Yeah, the word advantage is dubious. I
thought the word first-ish was pretty dubious.
Yeah, first-ish, perhaps, in terms of grammar. But we were definitely the first mover. Is this an advantage? I don't know. I've learned a lot in the last 4 years. And in the last year, I've started to meet people who are, also really interested in this problem and starting to really understand the space and recognize like the power in the space. I just came from a lunch with someone who's, just thinking like, my God, this is just totally untapped area. And, why isn't anyone thinking about this? And I'm like, hang on, we've been thinking about it for ages. So I guess for me, there's a lot of power in being a first mover, because you can set the narrative, you can define the narrative. We've made a lot of impact. Like, we've got very, very archaic industries, and people that have been in roles doing the same thing day out, day in for a long time, thinking differently about the future and what the future might look like. And so I hope that as a first mover, we can reap the benefit of that. And I guess we're on track to do that. We are kind of certainly well ahead of the game relative to other companies in our space. But we've had to kind of wade through a lot of crap, for want of a better word, for people that didn't believe, people that didn't think the industry could work this way, us having to work out what the regulation says we can and can't do. There is no regulation for what we do, which is called pass-through voting, yet. It's in policy. There's a bill in the Senate right now about it, but if you're looking for guidance from any of the regulators, it's not there. So that, I guess, means that things may take 5 times longer, and we're quite likely to get it wrong a few times before we land on the right answer.
And just on that specific point about the ever-changing, or at least expected to change, regulatory environment, how do you, as a company, stay across that? Is that through advisors? Is that through your laser-like focus?
Yeah, maybe we could do that better. I think, how do we stay on top of it? Like, I read about it. We know everyone in the space. I'm in a niche space. Like, this is proxy voting it affects everyone, but no one knows about it. So there's a few people who we really need to pay attention to, and a few pieces of regulation that are super relevant for us. And otherwise, I guess for me, like, understanding the regulation is trying to look at like proxies. So what has happened in democratization of dividend payments? Like, that's the type of thing that I would look at to try and understand how I think regulation is going to evolve in the proxy voting space, for example. But also talking to kind of prospective partners, understanding what regulation they think about is interesting. Talking to other startups in the space, trying to work out, how far are they going to push the boundaries before they, what do they feel like is gray versus black and white when it comes to regulation? I think in finance, that's something that's a bit difficult. Like, you want to drive change and you want to push the boundaries, but you obviously don't want to, break the law. So, but the kind of gap between that is not always super clear.
Yeah, but you're heavily regulated in a very regulatory changing environment, I guess, which presents its own quite intriguing intellectual challenges. I want to ask you about another challenge, which is this. Active stewardship models clearly are transforming the ESG space, the greater awareness of it, as you alluded to. How do you as a business maintain saliency or differentiation? Is it about scale? Is that actually the key to the future success of your business, or is it more about innovation?
So I would say that we are primarily an infrastructure play. So we help, if a fund manager is voting on a human rights issue at Tesla, then what we want to do is help that fund manager to understand how all of their individual underlying investors want them to vote. That could be an endowment, it could be your granny, it could be a pension fund. We want to collect all the opinions through the different platforms that those businesses or people use and feed them so that the fund manager can act with more information and more insight on how their underlying investors, their customers, their clients want them to vote. Or perhaps pass that vote directly through, which is what I'm talking about if I say pass through voting. The idea that they would just kind of hold their hands up and give the vote to the underlying investor. That really is an infrastructure play. It's about scale. So how can we be in all the places where people are voting, and how can we be in all the places where the vote is kind of being submitted and being passed into the kind of vote plumbing, we would call it, so that it actually reaches that end company, whether it be Tesla or Twitter or some mining company in Australia. And I think ultimately, at the moment, we play a bit of a user interface role. Like, we are the submission platform for the retail investor at the moment because there isn't one. Ultimately, what we would like to see is kind of all brokers and all investment platforms having a facility for their investors to vote, and then we're collecting the votes and making sure they go to the right place. And that is what we have with some of our customers. So Cushion, for example, is a customer of ours where they have built their own voting functionality on the front end of their platform. So it's all in their branding, it looks brilliant, but we are the ones running around in the background collecting all of the votes and making sure that those votes go to the right fund managers. So yeah, data, infrastructure play, we care about scale rather than kind of having a flashy front end ultimately, although we do currently have a flashy front end.
Let's move on to the funding round. Very successful funding round just last month, and I'm interested both from your perspective, but also what that perspective might yield for other entrepreneurs watching this. Describe that process. $19 million raised. Talk it through to what extent it ran as envisaged. How was that process for you?
It was a really successful fundraise. I'm really happy about it, and we closed probably just in time for the markets, and we closed it in February, so it was pretty good timing. We really wanted to raise money from strategic investors, so those investors that could really help us. This is, as I said, it's a niche industry. There's a lot of barriers to entry in terms of the existing players, kind of very traditional incumbent businesses. We needed partners who could kind of support us to break into that. And I also wanted an investor from the US because we want to break into the US market. So we kind of designed the round in that way, and we did succeed in kind of getting that triage of investors. So we have our lead investor is New York based, also specialists in fintech. They actually previously ran both a broker and a voting platform. So really, really understand our space and therefore are supportive and kind of understand the challenges and the opportunities, obviously. And then our other two institutional investors are Fidelity Ventures and Legal & General, both of whom in some part of their business are customers, and then of Tumelo's, and then in the other part of the business, are really partners of ours to help us drive change in the places that we want to see it and access information we need to be able to access, and help us to design the solutions that we're building, essentially. And then we have kind of an array of other investors, I think you would call them angel investors, who are supporting of the cause or really understand the space as well. So yeah, it was a great raise, and it really sets us up for success over the next couple of years as well, especially in this market.
And of course, money is the driver, but also reputation. We're talking about the blue chip investors of L&G and Fidelity. That as a badge of I don't know, integrity or quality is presumably pretty important for you.
Yeah, I think especially going into the US is helpful. Like, I think we've got a really good reputation in the UK. We have a lot of customers. We have about 20 different platforms that we work with here in Britain, but so we're relatively well known and trusted, I think. whereas in the US, it's a totally kind of fresh ground for me. So it's helpful to be able to say that our investors obviously are also customers, really believe in what we're doing, and they can to some extent help us move into the US as well, because Fidelity is a US business ultimately.
And what was the role of your advisors during this? I mean, I'm assuming you had advisors marshalling you along this course towards $90 million. Describe how that worked, and also what recommendations you make for other entrepreneurs. Many entrepreneurs, of course, think they're in charge of their own destiny and they drive forwards and so on. But advisors, particularly at this level, are pretty critical.
So it's a good question. We don't lean particularly heavily on advisors, to be honest, for that type of thing. We've got, where I have found advisors very helpful is for industry expertise and relevant network connections. So, for example, I have a great advisor in the pension space. He knows everyone, everything about pensions. He knows how the market's changing. We can talk about regulation. When I want to meet the right consultants, he can introduce me. He kind of brought our first customers to us, super relevant and helpful. And then similarly, like I have an advisor in the kind of procurement, sales, commercial space. We can talk about pricing, we can talk about contracting, we can talk about getting through procurement at these massive enterprise customers we have. And she's brilliant. But we don't really have an advisor, I suppose, in the fundraising space. That said, our existing angel investors who we've collected our pre-seed and seed round have always been helpful in kind of helping us shape the following round and kind of introducing us to the right people. And, to be fair, I would certainly call many of them advisors. But I've probably not been as proactive as some other founders I know in kind of building an advisory board. And like I know that other founders do find it very useful. Personally, I like having advisors around for kind of ad hoc, being able to go to them and seek advice proactively when we need it.
And you mentioned angel investor. I think one of your, in the seed round investment, all of 2019, September, whenever it was, that first £1 million, that included Peter Gabriel was involved early stage. How did that come about?
Yeah, people love that fact. Yeah. I think, so that came through a connection in Bristol, just very random connection. Someone who was close to the business and who believed in what we were doing connected us to Peter because he is interested in the democratizing financial markets and generally doing social good. It's very kind of supportive of Amnesty International, I think, and other causes like that. So I think we kind of just made it past the post. Like we were, maybe too fintech for him almost, but actually ultimately our mission is obviously kind of democratization of wealth, so it fit within his remit. And then we had lots of other investors, some of whom Peter connected me to actually, and like Jeremy Collar, for example, is a major investor of ours. He's super passionate about using shareholder engagement to drive change on issues, especially animal welfare and kind of factory farming, veganism. So you find kind of weird and wonderful angel investors in different places and who are investing for different reasons, whether generally it's always got a kind of financial remit to it, but there will be parts of our product and our offering and our mission that investors will align themselves to.
Yeah, certainly what's absolutely sort of burns through your story, if that's not the wrong expression, is that that sense of purpose. And I guess it's perhaps a simplistic point, but a rising sense of purpose appears to have been, if anything, perhaps accelerated from the pandemic. People have taken a pause to think about why they do what they do. Do you think to that extent, there's an element of zeitgeist, that sense of purpose there for you?
Yeah, 100%. I think the helpful thing about having a purpose is that it steers you in terms of what you build and what you don't build, what you explore and what you don't explore. I think there are just a million things that we could be doing, and we do talk about them a lot and quite easily find ourselves feeling quite distracted, but it helps kind of reroute you on the track that you initially wanted to be on. I suppose there are limitations in that as well. There are lots of good ideas that we've probably let go of because they're not aligned with our purpose, but may have been commercially viable. For example, I think especially in this space in finance, it's easy to find things that are commercially very interesting but have bad incentives or don't really fit your agenda. And so I think we've been quite good at saying no to them. And then aside from that, having purpose obviously helps you with customers, but it helps you grow a team of people that are really aligned with each other, and it helps you attract people. And when you're maybe smaller and you can't afford to pay the best salaries, people will take a pay cut to work for a company that has purpose, and you need that in the beginning, really, to an extent.
Well, we'll come on to team in a second. And to some extent, you've covered this, but I want to talk about motivation, including your own personal motivation. There are no wrongs, essentially, in motivation. Business is ultimately a choice, particularly for entrepreneurs. It may be the test, launch, refine, scale, exit, retire, fine, or social good, absolutely all good, or sustainability focus, or business as a continual challenge, a test, a hobby. We'll test ourselves at the margin. What motivates you personally, Georgia?
I agree with your statement. I've got 2 co-founders and we're definitely motivated by different things. For example, my CTO, Ben, is super interested in being challenged and wants to just constantly work on hard problems. And I think the minute Tumelo got easy, purpose-driven or otherwise, he would want to be somewhere else. I don't think that's likely to happen in the near future, so that's okay.
Hastily, yeah.
I think for me, I'm definitely driven by like the I want to call it a social outcome. I like the change in the industry. I like to see that we're having impact. I like to see that we're making people think differently. Ultimately, I studied climate change and kind of conservation. I'm super interested in biodiversity conservation specifically. I would like to think that what we were doing had some impact on that in the long term, and kind of provided another lever for NGOs and other people to drive change on that issue specifically, although the platform itself is neutral. So I'm not kind of running around championing all the biodiversity votes on the platform, but that's, in terms of my own agenda, what I'm particularly interested in and what drives me.
Albeit, yes, specifically because of its neutrality. Therefore, anyone with a particular focus, or back to that video on your site when someone discovered there's their pension was investing in tobacco companies, that's a no-no, at least for them and for many. I wondered about, again, on the personal side of you've been through this sort of rapid odyssey from the student days to a highly successful entrepreneur. Do you feel in any way similar to other entrepreneurs? For example, is obsession not just useful but essential for entrepreneurs?
Obsession? I suppose obsession about what is a bit of a question, because I feel there's so many things you could be obsessed about in business. I suppose obsession about the business, yes, I think so. I think in our space takes a lot of thought. It's very complex. There's a lot of nuance. The detail is really important. So I think being obsessed about the outcome you're trying to achieve is helpful. I think what we've had to learn is that we can't be fixed to a specific product. We really need to think about users, but we also need to think about stakeholders and the regulators, and what solution the market demands of us, rather than one end user, perhaps. But I'm sure I'm like other entrepreneurs in that, the business never sleeps, and that's, you're always thinking about it, especially as the team grows. That becomes, more and more the case that you need to make sure people are aligned, and, people are equipped to make good decisions, and, that just becomes, I guess, harder and harder the bigger it gets.
I suspect you say the business never sleeps. I suspect there's a PhD to be done on entrepreneurs and to the degree to which they sleep.
Yeah.
And their sleep patterns must be, it is pretty.
Well, my time is like split between the UK and New York at the moment, and London and Bristol when I'm in the UK. So yeah, I spend a lot of time traveling. My carbon offsets are high, that's for sure. It's not an ideal situation at the moment. So I need to move to New York permanently, probably. But yeah, I guess it's part and parcel of the entrepreneur, I suppose.
That will come. Again, on a personal point of view, this odyssey, as Tumelo has moved from a student campaign, and I'm not minimizing it by saying it, but that is its genesis, into worldwide tech. So you personally have been developing, are developed fully into a chief exec, pitching for huge funds, running an increasingly complex business. What advice would you give to other entrepreneurs on this type of journey?
Oh gosh. I'm not sure I'm qualified to give advice to anyone, but maybe back to the advisor piece. Like, I think we don't really call them advisors, but surrounding yourself with people that really know what they're doing and really understand the space, or have driven change, in some kind of parallel circumstance, whether it's your market or another one, your industry or another one. I think we didn't do that soon enough. Like, we relied on ourselves too much for too long, and therefore didn't learn as quickly as we could have about the industry or about how to run a business. I think we could have learned things faster and cut corners faster, better, I suppose. And we did hire, you know, we hired a couple of really experienced people early on. I think we could have done more of that. Now we're hiring leaders, kind of more leaders into the business, and perhaps we should have done that sooner. So for me, it's really about, there's a maybe it's just easy to say this with hindsight, but we had a lot of kind of faith in ourselves and, you know, drive to do it and make it happen. And actually, you know, probably would have been wise to look around us and think, actually, you know, who could help us on this journey. And
you say faith. I think faith is what Tumelo means in
it is, yeah.
It's ambient, yeah. Yeah, it's slightly odd that faith is basically a value set, whereas your world is it's a much more empirical world of proof, and you can demonstrate the value of the offering that you have. Can we just come onto the team side? We are coming towards the end of this session, but I want to talk about you know, again, from other entrepreneurs' perspectives and your experience. How should entrepreneurs help build their team so that someone perhaps capable of catching the rogue balloon before it goes up into the stratosphere, or, you know, whether you're recruiting more for culture and attitude than you are for skill set necessarily?
So again, I just maybe would have done this slightly differently. We have a great team, and the kind of founding people in our team are still in our team, and we would absolutely not be here without the way that we did actually build the team. I think that we really focus on culture, having people that were kind of self-starters, go-getter type individuals who could kind of manage themselves. And that's been really helpful, because it means that we have been able to kind of maintain a certain amount of autonomy and kind of empowerment in our culture. We've never had a kind of very hierarchical structure. We are now kind of putting in a bit of formal leadership, let's say, at 50 people. But, you know, some companies get to 50 and they've got like 3 layers of management or more. We've managed to avoid that, and therefore I think I've got like pretty happy, fulfilled team, and we've got the kind of foundations of a culture which can grow from that. So having people like that who can kind of are entrepreneurial themselves and can manage that and kind of cope with it, because we have also hired people who can't cope with that, and, you know, you realize pretty quickly, like, oh, they're waiting to be told what to do. This is not going to work. Because if you hang on to those types of people, then you end up with a culture that tells people what to do, and then everyone else is going to be disincentivized. So, you know, you have to decide which culture you want, and then you have to stick with that, and you need to hire to it, because you can't be all things to all people. You really can't. And even at 50 people, you know, you need to make sure that there's well-being and there's support for people, and, you know, and people can speak up, and, you know, but they're not forced to. And there needs to be kind of some level of flexibility, and it has to become more malleable, because with 50 people, you're going to have a real set of personalities and array. But ultimately, you still need to know what your values are, and you need to understand where your line is, and, you know, someone can meet it, but they can't cross it. And ultimately, I think we've been really good at that. And we have a strong culture because of it, and people would describe our culture in, you know, I think a pretty clear way. The thing that I would have done differently is hire people that had more industry, like domain expertise, people that understood the proxy voting space, people that understood how fund managers did stewardship. You know, we learned all of that from scratch, from like conversations, from talking to stakeholders, from speaking to advisors. And just, I think we could really have saved ourselves a lot of time by bringing in people who had domain expertise earlier into the team, and could just have said, you know, this works, this doesn't. And maybe they would have made us blind to some things that actually we've ended up doing. That's, I suppose, a risk. But I think retrospectively, that's the only thing I would have done differently.
Yeah. So last couple of questions. I suspect you can guess what the last one's going to be about, the destiny or future of the business. We'll come to that in a moment. But how do you have enough time to think, and how do you prioritize, given that the business is growing at the lick that it is?
I don't feel like I have enough time to think. I was just thinking that on my bike on the way back from the meeting I just at. It was a really interesting meeting. Felt like I learned a lot that could be applied to the business. And then I was just thinking, gosh, when am I going to think about how to apply that to the business? When am I going to communicate that? Who do I need to communicate it to? Now we have 50 people, we're like trying to work out who's going to do the thinking. It's also difficult. I need to get better at that. Perhaps, you know, I'm really good in the mornings, and I think setting time aside in the morning to think about strategy before the day starts and you become really reactive is something that's really been helpful for me. But that becomes harder and harder the more people you have, because you just have less time to yourself. I think that prioritizing, I suppose, like our right lists and trying to do the thing you most don't want to do first is generally the best way for me to go about it. Yeah. But we as a company have objectives and key results. So, you know, we set as a team, what are we trying to achieve over the next quarter? How are the teams going to contribute to that? And so ultimately, you know, every single person, including me and the team, should really understand, like, what are the top 3 priorities of this company? And if I'm not doing something that falls into that bucket, or if I'm spending a lot of time on something that doesn't fall into that bucket, then I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah. So yes, that last question about the future of the business. I mean, it's not been around long. It's going at a stellar lick. It's got this extra investment, massive investment, huge opportunity in the US. Its time has come. It's zeitgeisty. It's right front and center, and so on. Where might it be? Where might you be in 3-5 years' time?
I think ultimately shareholder ownership will be democratized at the kind of policy level. So it will become regulation that fund managers need to receive insight from their investors on what they care about, or potentially pass through the voting rights to those people who are invested in their funds. And we're super well positioned to be the infrastructure, the rails, the pipes, whatever you want to call them, that funnel those votes from A to B. So ultimately for us, the future is being plugged into all of the broker platforms, every point where someone might submit a vote, and all of the kind of proxy plumbing providers, which is the other side where the vote actually gets submitted to the company. And you know, that part of the marketplace has just never existed before. You know, previously the vote stopped here, and we're going to extend it down. And that is what we will be providing the infrastructure for globally, hopefully in 5 years' time, for sure.
Well, Georgia, this could have gone on for much longer. There's so much to explore with you, but thank you for your time today. Yours is an extraordinary story, and yours is an absolutely extraordinary trajectory. Where you're going to be in a year's time, let alone 3 or 5, the Lord alone knows. But to Georgia Stewart, founder and chief executive of Tumelo, many thanks indeed for this EntreConf interview. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.